Yeah.
Welcome, everyone. This is the National Security Decision-Making Game presentation regarding our new Lunar Colonies game. And I'm Merle Robinson. I've often been referred to as the head cat herder at NSDM. And Scott Macmann, one of our other developers, is with me, and we're going to walk through the process of game design for the types of games that we run, particularly one about a potential lunar colony situation in 2050, because we had certain objectives and ideas of what we wanted to explore, and we tried to build a game that was fit for the purpose, and we'll talk about that. So this first slide shows our original founders. We've been around for 35 years. Yes, it's true, 35 years. And we started out originally at the Combined DragonCon Origins Convention in 1990 with the two brothers, Dan and Mark McDonough, both of who worked at the Naval War College and were asked to show hobby gamers how the military war games. So we come out of the Naval War College tradition. That's pretty much how we're set up in NSDM. We're basically focused on gaining insights into decision-making by looking at things like culture, circumstance, choice, and consequences. And we run immersive live action role-play games at a variety of conventions, academic, and occasionally professional events. For example, our last professional event was at Fort Benning, where we did an event for WinSec. So basically, we run an immersive environment. We basically start with a core of history, and then we introduce counterfactual events in some instances to get people's interest going. We've also experimented with sci-fi and a number of periods. Our core games tend to cover the Cold War in the early 60s and contemporary politics and international affairs. These are the kinds of places we've showed up in the past because we've been around for 35 years. We have a YouTube channel, and occasionally we have recordings that we do standalone that show up there. We have a Facebook page. We also have a web page. So there's our web page. And you can look us up on Facebook under this title. Facebook we generally use as sort of a news reader to talk about things that we find interesting in the news. And we don't really try to support the things that we post, but we pick things that are interesting to share with folks. Our big events most years are Origins, Gen Con, and DragonCon. And we normally have over 600 people participating in our games and other events over the course of the season. We're also now a nonprofit organization, a 501c3, with a general education background and approach. Basically, what we do in our games is we focus on four kinds of things. We talk about culture in terms of people's background, in terms of the sort of the gestalt of different countries, because we have country cells that we use in our game, and factions within those countries that traditionally are large political groups of hundreds of thousands or thousands plus people that have a common agenda and a budget and so on. We also talk about circumstance. So basically, that's one of the things we're really good with, is we could talk about what kind of situation are you in as a national leader, and then the players make choices and we show them the kinds of consequences they can have. So basically, I'm a retired Department of Defense analyst. I was a Lean Six Sigma black belt and a time study guy. I'm also a graduate of the Military Operations Research Society Wargaming Certificate Program, and a whole bunch of other stuff. But basically, I've become the lead designer at the National Security Decision-Making game since around the year 2000. Scott, would you like to walk through your background?
Sure. So I'm a graduate of the Fort Benning School for Boys, also known as the Infantry Officer Basic Course. and then later became an intelligence officer, a military intelligence officer. So I have an Army background in my professional life, and left the military after the great the first Great War, also known as the Persian Gulf War, and took that opportunity and did some other stuff. And today I write science fiction and fantasy. I'm an editor and publisher with Dragon Street Press, and I'm also president of the Cincinnati Fiction Writers. And in my spare time, I'm a volunteer with the National Security Decision Making Game.
Okay. So basically, we want your feedback. We have a QR code that you can scan and answer our general questionnaire. We have questionnaire elements that include how you can volunteer for the group, that you sort of get to pick what you want to go through. All our presentations and all our materials based on public information. We don't do any classified. All of the stuff that we use in our slides are under fair use doctrine. And basically, you shouldn't consider that this is the opinion of people's employers, because this is what we do on the side. So this particular presentation, we're going to talk about a view from Earth for lunar colonies in 2050. And because we do multiplayer games, there are a few things that we did in regards to how we approach this that we're going to talk about in the course of the presentation. Basically, what we wanted to do was provide an educational game talking about lunar challenges. And we basically run multiplayer mega games. So we have anywhere from 7 to 130 players in our games. We do the different venues, and we focus on player choice. One of the key things, though, is seeing that our staff that is adjudicating the game has a deep knowledge of the issues that we're going to present and of the situations that are available. And because we have about 25 volunteers, we managed to build a good level of expertise in a lot of different areas. Normally, our NSDM games, the niche is geopolitics. We focus on group tensions in different countries that are internal and external. And that means we keep track of current issues, historical issues, resources, and it all has to do with the contest between competition and compromise. So why did we do this game? Well, we had a staffer with an idea. It's the guy in the other window. He said, why don't we do da-da-da? Because when we go to different conventions, there's a lot of demand for new and high-tech kinds of situations. DragonCon got us started experimenting with near future items where we go to like 2030, 2040. Start with a concept where there'd be a major development technologically, and then take that to some logical conclusions as a starting point for the game. And because of that, people evidenced more and more interest in things regarding space and near atmospheric areas. We thought that that would likely lead to new situations and techniques, because it's part of our own self-education project that we try to pick one new area to work on every year. And we often do that. Sometimes it's, a new area that we do every like 2 years or 3 years. So like we did an American Revolution game about 4 years ago, and now that's become a staple, talking about the First and Second Continental Congress. This particular focus, though, is the moon. So I'm going to let Scott pick up from here and sort of talk about how we got a customer base, what kinds of things we're doing, and where we started out.
Yeah, thank you, Merle. So as Merle was saying, our typical, format. I mean, the way we structure our games is, we are a live action role playing game. As I often jokingly tell folks, we're a LARP. We're a LARP for political science and history geeks, and which is perhaps not completely off the mark. The other thing, which I think Merle referred to or referenced, is the fact that we put the players into cells, and as he usually says in our briefings, you are on a cell, you are not on a team, and which is important, because your opponent, the person you're most competing with, is probably not in another cell. let's say that we're doing the Cold War or the Cuban Missile Crisis. Your opponent is probably not your counterpart with the Soviet Union, but rather in your own country. So if you're, for instance, the chief of staff of the army, your biggest opponent is probably not the minister of defense of the Soviet Union, or group of Soviet forces in Germany, but rather maybe the chief of naval ops, because you want a new armored division, but the chief of naval ops really wants a new aircraft carrier, and Congress is probably only going to pay for one of those. So again, your biggest opponent is the guy on your own, in your own country, in your own cell. So, but we'll get to more of that in a few slides down the way. So again, could you go back? So live action role playing, we believe in the value of creating an immersive scenario as much as possible. So providing materials and a story that is going to be appealing and is going to trigger the sense of really being an actual person who is able to make decisions that matter. Very importantly, we focus on providing a situation of real choices and consequences, and consequences are always essential. That there can be things unintended. So, all right.
Yeah, we often love what we call the law of unintended consequences in our games, because we're doing them in a public environment. We try to make it entertaining. So sometimes we will stretch plausibility, and other times, if we're in an academic environment, we're very, very specific. So essentially, as we talk about design, what we're trying to do is help understand the situation that we're going to do a simulation on, explore the different vectors and options that people might have, and think about likely consequences so that we're going to be prepared in advance for whatever the players do. Most of the time that works, but sometimes it does not. We had one game that was contemporary a few years ago where our Japanese players got rid of a lot of radioactive soil from Fukushima. And it was funny, the Chinese contractor built a new island in the South China Sea. Okay, and that was the players. So as we talk about design, one of the things that you try to do is figure out what's fit for the purpose that you want to do. And the reason that we want to do this is to basically have a general type of game that's going to be educational, to give people some basics that they otherwise would not understand unless they read several books. We have an audience that was for the general public and gamers for the most part. There are going to be a few instances where we would run this in an academic environment, and we actually have done that a couple of times. And then because of the one things we've discovered, NSDM started out as an 8-hour game for real policy wonks and geeks. And it had a lot of stuff about budget and a lot of stuff about national policy. And we discovered when we're in a public venue, people don't want to spend 8 hours anymore. Attention spans started to reduce even before we all got cell phones in our pocket and spent all our time looking at those. So we started generating 4-hour games, and mostly that's what we run now, which means we've had to learn some new techniques. We do a lot to compress information. We have a lot of better play aids. We worked on our in-briefings so that they're concise, but include all the things that are essential. We have our staff trained to do what I call the 1-minute teaching moment. When somebody comes up with an issue, we teach them how we handle that in the right there at that point in time. Our format is multiplayer with various national cells. We almost always play with more than one nation state involved. And our mechanics are generally designed to have continuous flow. So we're doing in-stride adjudication in the course of our games. Our rules are pretty basic, and we'll talk about some of those, because essentially these people have the same kinds of choices large groups do. And the core of our game is competition and compromise, and how the players negotiate with one another to get things accomplished or not accomplished. And then at the end, we look for feedback to try to see how did that work. So the particular environment, as I mentioned, is general public, time frames 4 hours, short briefings and play aids. So essentially, if we have a 4-hour game, we'll do a 15 to 20 minute in brief, and we'll do a 15 to 20 minute out brief where we ask them why they did that crazy stuff. Our venues are generally conventions and colleges or high schools. And when we talk about this, what are the things we had to think of? There were a number of elements that took this concept of let's do Lunar Colony game from concept to the specific setting. And I'll let Scott sort of walk through this chart.
Okay. Yeah. So, so again, the penguin up in the corner is, is a little amusing point there. But, so as we kick this around, it's like, there are all sorts of possibilities. However, as for instance, antimatter drive, or all sorts of wonderful, things that we read in science fiction. However, the point of NSDM has always been to be grounded in things that are real, or at least really plausible. And so as we pondered, because we do historical settings, we do current events, and we do some near future events, and we do some near future that are more or less real, and we do some near future that with a science fiction bent. But all of those we try to remain grounded in real possibilities. And so as we looked at the time frame, it was clear to us that pushing beyond the year 2050, so roughly 25 years, was going to push us into territory that we'd have to make some serious guesses about what might be, and which is something we really don't prefer to do. I mean, so if you think back 25 years from now, the year 2000, what we have today, 2025, is reasonably plausible from the year 2000, but from the year 1975, perhaps not quite so. And so, so that was the rationale behind thinking a mere 25 years forward. One of the other big pieces was the role in the game of the moon versus the Earth, or perhaps how to portray the relationship with the Earth and Moon. And
so let me add a point here, Scott. One of the real challenges we had as we looked at this was, how will play be driven by the players in a game? And the first proposal that people had in our staff was, well, why don't we just make it a couple of people that are in charge of the moon bases, and we'll have a regular game where all these national cells have all their different factions. And what we realized very quickly is they'd be the tail of the dog. They'd be begging for resources all the time. Their choices would be entirely constrained by what went on back home. And that it wasn't going to be very fun for the people that were running the lunar colonies. So what that meant is we had to have a game that was focused on the moon. And there were two ways to do that. One was to see that your thematic stories and scenarios were built at very high level. So it's like a first contact scenario or something like that, which at some conventions we've been known to get close to, because we do cater to our audience. And for example, our Origins audience is more historically oriented. Academic audiences are very historically oriented. So we want to be very fact-based and very linear in the way we extrapolate a lot of stuff. But when you go to Dragon Con, it's cosplay and sci-fi. So they want to see the Star Trek kind of stuff. And so what we basically decided was it needed to be focused on the moon. and the Earth needed to be the incidental. So the major groups and personality structures and political structures needed to be moon-based. We also knew that we wanted to run cells that would run from 7 to 25 people, because that's a manageable size for us to have a cell controller, as well as our game directors, our military controllers, and economic folks. So as we went to the next step, the real question was, how are we going to figure out how we populate the moon? And one of the challenges was, well, how many people can you get to the moon? So basically, we took some of the plans, like the Artemis spaceship plans and so on, and said, if we produced a lot of those, and if we produced enough to basically run like a launch a month, how many people could we physically get to the moon? And that gave us a range of how we were going to size that. The other question, but that was far more important, was what's the settlement model? Is it every nation for himself, which means it's going to tend to look much more like a sci-fi environment? Or is it going to be an Antarctic research station model or a World Heritage site model? And as we explored that, we basically looked at it and said, well, you know, it seems like it'd be a lot more interesting if we had national concessions under a World Heritage kind of site. So that's sort of where we're going, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. The other issue was manageability. There are not going to be a lot of strategic choices available, in the sense of they're not going to, generally speaking, decide to build a new base. They're not, generally speaking, going to start launching stuff from the moon. After all, it's 2050. How many hundreds or thousands of people can you get to the moon in that period, and can they prosper? So the one thing that we did do that was a little unreal is we sort of presumed that the infrastructure for them to start out in the game was present, which was stretching reality a lot in terms of resource capabilities, but it gave us the environment to explore the kinds of issues that might come up in a future moon-based organization.
So we came up with a number that by the year 2050, there are roughly 8,000 persons stationed on the moon. And 25 years from now, we may be looking back on it's like, boy, we sure underestimated that, or boy, we sure overestimated that. It is what it is, but it seemed like a plausible number after we ran a bunch of assumptions of how that number could be generated and why that number. So for instance, Antarctica. So the entire Antarctic continent, there are roughly 8,000 scientists and various maintenance types in Antarctica at any given time. More during the summer than the winter. So our model, looking at a long history of legal treaties, etc., was to work with the existing series of treaties and agreements, and that pre-exist, and then projecting that forward. So we saw something kind of like Antarctica, which is sort of like a combination of the law of the sea, in the sense that a moon base is sort of like a ship on the sea, sort of. And however, the right or the reason or the ability to be located there on the moon is permitted or under the auspices of a concession and under a treaty on the United Nations. So we used the United Nations trustee system, which was the United Nations version of the mandate system that the League of Nations had, and thought that this was the trustee system was something that you could build upon plausibly without creating an entirely new structure.
So what that generated for us was a situation where you have uh, at least one base that's international in its focus, that's sort of all the countries who wouldn't be able to launch or develop something on their own. And you'd have basically major powers turning to this authority, which we presumed was going to be a UN surrogate, to basically say, I want to build a base on the moon with X purpose, and this part of what I'll do is for the world in general, and another part of it's what I'm going to do for me. So what that basically means is we built little city-states on the moon that have agendas. And when you start talking about, well, okay, what are they going to do on the moon? The focus of our games is cooperation and competition. Well, normally that involves trade, either horse trading for concepts and policy decisions or horse trading based on economics. So that got us looking into, well, what's the moon going to produce? And the big thing that a series of moon bases is likely to produce is research, which is pretty intangible. So we really didn't want to start giving out research chips or anything like that because it's hard for people to wrap their head around. So that's one problem. The other thing is you can make titanium because there's a high level of titanium in the lunar regula. There's the soil, so to speak. And there's postulations that you can get helium-3, which is a pretty valuable product and used a lot in medical technology on Earth today. But the amount that's used is fairly limited. The other problem that you run into is the same one that we've heard in the news before. If you took the most expensive thing on Earth, which is like cocaine, and you put it on Mars, and you tried to ship it back to Earth, it wouldn't be worth doing because it's cost you more to get it than it would whatever. So unless there's a trip already going back because they started delivering supplies, because moon bases probably can't produce everything they need, especially when there's only 8,000 or so people on the moon to start with. So there's stuff you've got to import on a regular basis. You're going to have vitamins and food because there's only going to be so many things you can grow. You're going to have custom tools that require special equipment. You're going to have supplies for your 3D metal or rosin or whatever kind of printers because we can extrapolate to that. And you're going to have personnel rotation or rotation because somebody got sick and you can't fix them on the moon. Try to think about going back to Earth in a spaceship while you have appendicitis. Maybe not so good. So one of the other things we recognized was governance and development of these stations was going to have international complications, national complications, and local complications. And the big thing that they were going to be discussing was projects. What are we going to do to make the moon better and to have the moon generate some kind of useful thing to come back to planet Earth? So the original vision that we had for this game, and in our first iteration, had a number of elements. Scott, do you want to walk through those?
Yeah. So, so as a reasonable extrapolation of that, it's like, well, as you're, constructing and managing your base and building, new dorms and et cetera, the things that are going to matter to you are going to be the types of people that are available to you, so skill types, and the materials that are available to you. And so, we thought, well, golly, those are probably two really key things that we should include is the ability to, the limitations and the opportunities that come from having different skills available to you as a base commander, and the various types of materials available to you. That you can then apply against the projects that you choose to pursue. So I think we can flip.
Yeah.
So our conclusions, it's like, well, a great game, will have, these features, it's like, we're going to use the UN as an umbrella organization, to keep everyone smiling and happy with each other. Each base that exists is going to have a a national priority or a focus or an inclination. Will for gameplay will give bases a reasonably identical structure, although not truly mirrors of one another. We'll include morale and personnel, as issues or as factors, and we'll also give them an ability to cooperate. So, in addition to the ability to pursue local or base projects, we thought it would make sense that there would also be some lunar-wide things that they could work on, which would then reasonably track that sometimes there are big things that need to be done.
So the other thing I want to emphasize at this point is, we've learned over the years how to compress an awful lot of information in those 15 to 20-minute in briefs. Because essentially, when we run a 4-hour game, people get about 3.5 hours worth of play, which means you've got to compress a lot of stuff into that time. One of the things we've done is we have play aids that have been generally available that'll talk about certain pieces. We have lots of facilitators and staff to help coach players, because we operate as their staff and will answer the technical questions an individual playing might not know. Like, for example, if you play a conventional game, how many aircraft carriers do the United States have? How many aircraft carriers do the Russians have? What's the relative size of the economy? What are their big products? That kind of stuff is important in a regular game, and it's also important in a moon game. So having done that a lot, we had pretty ambitious program. And what we're going to talk about over the course of this is how our original plan had a lot of features, and what we did in the first prototype that we ran had a lot of moving parts, and we discovered that we really needed to go to another level of simplification for our later iterations. So the kinds of things that were design issues was basically this colonization model where we benchmarked station size, which Scott talked about, and basically figured the largest probable commitments in terms of getting people up there. We assumed Artemis size loads weekly, apportioned loads by concession, and then we looked at what the moon would produce and what kinds of things those colonies would need to consume. So what kind of player decisions are there? Okay. Well, we basically figured out that if you're doing a heritage site, it's going to be weapons pretty much prohibited. You don't want to have a whole bunch of guys doing Starship Trooper battles with 10 or 15 people. Because, how big is your military going to be when you've got to have a guy in a space suit and with special equipment and everything else, and you're going to try to sneak around the moon, which probably has satellites observing it all the time, and there's going to be issues with that. So we really didn't want it to be a military game, but we didn't rule out the possibility that people might try to manipulate that process and do something on the side, whether it was an option for eliminating certain other folks or sabotaging equipment or whatever, and that's a player decision. So we didn't really build that directly in, but we make it clear to the players they have those options. And then there are going to be mostly political issues, and it's going to be about how to set priorities and how to distribute resources. It's also going to deal with the cultural change and the issues that you would have on the moon. So essentially what we've said is you start reasonable settlement around 2030, and in those 20 years, you've got people that are going to be there pretty much continuously. Some project people are going to rotate in and out, but you're going to have people that are never going to go home. And what's the impact of that? That's the kind of thing that we're talking about. So, as we start trying to balance fun versus reality, the developmental themes and the injects were going to be key, because time is very limited in a game like this. And this is a new environment for all the players. We basically started having it set up to have, here are the political projects and so on you can do, and here are challenges, because space wants to kill you. That's an important lesson. You got to carry everything. If there's a mechanical failure, there's a problem. So what we do in the course of the game is provide challenges that affect all of the lunar stations or certain lunar stations that are designed to escalate the level of tension and conflict and concern so that they get a sense of really how dangerous it is. That was really one of our underlying themes that we wanted to get across as an educational point. So, then we had to say, what kind of groups are we going to have? Well, as you start looking at that model, one of the key issues is nations internationally tend not to trust one another. So there's certain functions, if you were building a World Heritage Site, that you really wouldn't want any one country to run. So we started thinking about, with this UN and international management process, what would you do? Well, you controlled imports so that you knew somebody wasn't smuggling, laser weapons or whatever onto the moon. So the landing site for all supplies is at the UN stations. Who's going to control the comm network and the satellite network for communication? There's Starlink. Well, it better be the UN, because nobody trusts one country to do it, even if it's the US. So what that meant is controlling imports and exports goes through the UN station, and we gave some options to sort of get around the export problem. And we'll talk to that in a minute. But basically, we started thinking about allocation of shipping space, control of major communications, site inspections, that kind of stuff. And that's an overlay as we started the next step of development. And then we looked at the different countries that we thought would have enough resources to send something up by 2050. Now, what we also looked at here was to try to have a thematic issue that we thought was going to come up on the moon and link it to a national base so that they've got pretty much a single focus in terms of what their underlying national priority is. Didn't really believe that was going to be that exclusive, but when you're doing research projects and things like that, there's going to be Chinese researchers that are interested in something, Japanese researchers, Indians, and whatever. And we basically looked at this and said, well, we want to have a USA base. We want to have like an EU base. We want to have a China base. Oh, we really should do something with Pan-Asian, but who can launch? Well, that's the Japanese and the Indians. So we had them work together because the Indians have lots of engineers and an ambition to do things, and the Japanese have money. And they also have launch facilities, slightly higher tech level for some things, slightly lower for others. We also decided we weren't going to have Russia have its own base, because with the whole Ukraine situation and everything else, is everybody going to trust them? Well, maybe not. But even if they could get a concession, the real issue is, do they have the resources? And our conclusion from our real world games is Russia's a declining state, which is part of the reason they're going after Ukraine now, to get those resources and population so that they might make it to the next generation. And their only likely partners are Iran and the DPRK. So what would they do? So we put a space station for them, because they could probably get that together. And we put a railgun on it, because that'll be good for storytelling. And that's an arbitrary decision. We knew it was an arbitrary decision. And that's not going to be played by players. That's going to be a potential plot cannon, no pun intended. Well, maybe there is a pun intended. Okay. So the next thing we did is we tried to figure out the structure of the bases, and we had a lot of fun because one of our teammates had some experience with AI art. So we have a bunch of copyright-free AI bases that we did playmats for, so that to make it easier for players to keep track of things. And we know there's one inaccuracy because all of the drawings were on surface bases, and you probably don't want to live on the surface because of all the other icky stuff like radiation and meteor strikes and micro strikes and all that good stuff. So this is a sample of one of the playmats, and essentially we said, okay, well, they're going to be projects. We'll let them work on 3 projects at a time, and we'll let them work on some moon-wide projects, and we'll let them work on some projects just for their base, like they might build more habitat units. And we said, what are the major systems a base is going to have? And then we looked at the kind of specialists they were going to have. And you're going to discover we had a problem with the number of specialists issue in a little bit. We also said, well, definitely food's going to be a problem, and morale's a problem. And we've seen that even with like the Antarctic stations in the real world, that these installations where people are isolated for long times. You may have people acting out. You may have to do something to keep them busy, whether that's a ping pong league or inter, base competitions and basketball games, although I don't think you'd have a basketball game that worked very well on the moon, some kind of issue in that regard. So the other thing we were hoping to do in the original, and we tried, and we found out it was very cumbersome, was trying to get them to understand project management. And that was an element that was a situation that had two elements to it. One was the kinds of skills and personnel that you would need. So we came up with some categories for those, and the kinds of resources you would need to run your installation. Some things would be investments and so on. And we cycled resupply shipments. And we'll talk about that original design and why we changed it in just a little bit, because that was part of our journey of discovery in the process. So, we had these skills distributed by base, so we had a nice little play aid, and it was way too complicated. So we had to go back to Mike Markowitz's thing about ruthlessly simplifying something after you put all of the elements in you thought were useful vectors to examine. And if we were doing an 8-hour game, we might try to go back to this, because it's an interesting component we had hoped to have, where you could see how you would, in a gross sense, manage people and manage supplies against projects, and what would happen if some of the challenges eliminated some of those people or supplies. All right.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very valid thing. It's just that in the time frame that we had to work with, we discovered that it was very much a bridge too far.
Yeah, it works really well when you have people that understood it because they worked on it. But when you start adding the general public, you find out there's plot complications. What is that? You put it with an enlisted after the sergeants worked with it. Well, whatever. All right. So, one of the things we try to do with our games is give visual and kinesthetic play aids. So we normally use player role cards and project cards. And in this one, we started doing event inject cards that describe the situation that we injected. Because in a regular game, we run a news feed on a monitor up front that has all the CNN news and all the stuff from Pravda and all the stuff from South China Post and all that kind of thing. And because the modern world is pretty good on communications, everybody knows. But these are primarily events that the players aren't going to have a lot of background on and need a paragraph or two of explanation. So we made them inject cards. Now, one of the things that you also see in our game is we've used a lot of stuff with a postcard format because we found that's a really concise way of doing things and giving people name tags. And we give one side is all the signs, symbols, and tokens of what they are. And the back side is all the stuff that they don't want everybody to know, like where their priorities are and what their victory conditions are, although we tend not to give extremely specific victory conditions because we want them thinking about things. So here's an example of the front of some of the kinds of cards. And we had a lot of fun with this because we picked things that you would extrapolate from what already is going on. And like I said, there's the signs, symbols, and tokens. You got a flag, you got a symbol, you've got the public description that everybody knows. And you can see how that structure really works well. And it also is really great in one respect. This is one of the things that we innovated with in the early 2000s because we used to have really long write-ups so you could read a page of text about your thing. And for an 8-hour game, that works. But this basically brings people in very quickly into that magic circle and suspends disbelief, and they realize what they are. These kinds of symbols, it's like Napoleon said, with these baubles, I can run an army, by giving out medals and glitzy stuff. And here's an example of some of the back sheets. So you can see, here's your motivation, here's the kinds of things that you can do. And you'll notice on this one, the Indian Lunar Commander, you operate the Indian ballistic launcher. So one of the things we did with several of these stations is we gave them a way to build a bull cannon kind of railgun that they can throw a cartridge into orbit for pickup later. And that is one of the ways people might bypass the import-export system. And we won't talk about whether or not a customs official might perhaps negotiate with someone to violate that process. And that's the kind of thing we sort of expected players to do. And yeah, they did a lot of that. And here's the kinds of projects that we gave them, because basically we took all of the projects that are on the board and all the projects we could extrapolate across the board that people are talking about for the moon. Now, the bad thing about this is it's very Amerocentric, because there aren't a lot of Chinese projects listed on a site like NASA lists their projects. There aren't a lot of Euro projects that are on a site that list like NASA projects. There are no Indian projects that list like on a NASA. You get a public affairs announcement or whatever, but they're all interesting and they're all useful. So we built a standard deck that said, here's what the purpose is, and then we tried to know behind the scenes. Generally, we came up with how much in the way of resources would you need to make this thing. And we wanted to have those projects be things that would get people thinking. Again, you're going to notice some of the AI art shows surface installations rather than underground tunnels and stations, but it looks cool and the players relate to that. Some players have read a moon is a harsh mistress, yes. But no, we didn't have enough time for them to get particularly creative with their railgun export launcher. So this was the question here, because I'm watching the chat. Now, you'll notice what this includes is where they can build extra habitats, where they can do orbiting solar stations. We also had some fun because at one point, the orbital robots had not been given a project, and the orbital AI started building something out of scraps in orbit, which gave them pause for thought. Because what we want to do with the game and with the scenario injects is to give the players situations where they have to explore, how could we deal with that? What would we choose to do? We weren't going to run Colossus in the Crab where, the AI takes over the moon and threatens to nuke everybody. But we did want to have them exposed to things. Now, you'll notice that one of the cards is Elysium. So one of the things we talk about in our injects, Elysium is a retirement site for scientists who have weak hearts and weak knees. And then later you're going to have total care issues. It's one of the injects. Because we want them to think about what do you have to do if you've got a group on the moon. Gotta go to this side. Okay. So here's some of the social and political challenges, and I'll let Scott cover those.
Yeah. So in the initial game, we actually didn't break them apart into by type, and we'll explain why we ended up creating or separating them into political and social challenges, safety challenges, etc. But we had a lot of fun. Creating a series of things that. So again, unlike the projects where they choose to pursue a particular line of research and science, the challenges are things that come at them, situations which then have to be dealt with. The Star-Crossed Lovers, was a fun one. Where you had two people from very different bases somehow develop a relationship, and then one wants to essentially defect to the other so that they can be together forever.
So that raises a number of interesting questions for the players, because different countries have different standards on what's permissible. For example, had this been a couple with a Chinese national, Chinese nationals don't have a lot of flexibility. They're considered like a government employee. Many of these people might be government or contract employees for some corporation. So leaving for contract purposes could be an issue, and asylum might be an issue because we don't want any of our citizens going to another country. Dealing with international situations is a challenge, and everybody has a different standard of law and cultural norms. So we really wanted to give them those kinds of challenges. One of the things we did in one of our other injects was we basically had the UN station have a food fight in the mess hall, because there was a question about, is that beef or is that pork? and people from different cultural backgrounds thinking that people were slipping things into their food.
I think
And
if
now
you
you've
flip
got a justice situation and an international incident and and that kind of challenge now the players get to try to resolve.
flip
Now,
flip the
yep.
flip the slide. I think food fight is next. Oh, one more, but there you go. So and also one of Merle's favorite is the fungus among us. Yeah. But the idea is, presenting things that that have to be figured out, and that some solution must be agreed upon in some sort of a timely manner. Oh, Merle, you're talking but can't hear you.
Because I muted the mic. So the focus here is really to get the players thinking about the issue and resolving the issue in a way that just doesn't throw resources at it. We're trying to get them to develop a approach to solving each one of the problems. And as Scott mentioned, the fungus among us is one of my favorites because we have had a problem on the ISS where there's this slime that's growing over the environmental unit, and they can't get rid of it because to get rid of it would require them to use chemicals that would then be in the atmosphere, in the ISS, and be a danger to the astronauts that are there. So let me go back. Let's see, get over here, go back. So here's some of the, we started looking at types of challenges as we built this. So there are political challenges, there are operational challenges, and then there are safety challenges. So, we had somebody acted out and tried to hack the moon base. People are in too tight and confined spaces and now they're acting out, or somebody has a mental breakdown. You're in an environment where you can't really develop a lot of medicine, but you'll notice one of our projects earlier. Let's see here, where is it? See the astropharmacy? Oh, if you invest in that early, you might be better able to deal with the other item. Part of it is getting them to understand the interaction and the symbiosis internal to bases and between bases, because no one base could do everything. Our goal in this entire game was to explore things and get the players thinking about the kinds of challenges they'd have on the moon. So one of the other underlying things that we've done with a couple of the player cards is talk about, you've been on the moon for 20 years. Your muscles are different. Your bones are different. You're never going home. So should there be lunar home rule? Are you loonies or are you earthers? So those things are things that we have the flexibility to let the players choose what they're going to discuss. And there are enough branches that they can go in lots of different directions. So, okay. So this is when we start talking about what didn't work. We were originally talking about supplies and logistics, and that became way too cumbersome for our game. So Scott,
this was the supply system. So items would get loaded up on the set to launch matrix, and then when they arrive, they go over into the other set of boxes, and and this was going to be supplies and personnel. 16 slots, to be filled each turn.
And the dynamic we thought we were going to have, and it started out okay. It just moved very slowly, and the level of friction for the game was tremendous. Was okay. I'm going to work on a particular project, like a new habitat. What stuff do I need to order and put in the pipeline? What kind of people do I need to get? And then there's like a UN administration council, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But the idea was they would have the political discussion about how to resource the overall moon projects, and they'd be trying to balance that with their own individual base projects, because that's what's going to provide the tension in a game of this scale and time frame.
And again, understanding that there's only 16 slots on the spaceship, so what's going to be on there, and and food needs to be, a certain amount of food, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So the original structure of the game was to look like this. And Scott, why don't you cover that?
Yeah. So the original structure, we had multiple bases. It was 4 or 5, and then each base would send a representative to the Lunar Council, and this Lunar Council was responsible for making all sorts of decisions. To allocate the resources, assign new personnel, to decide, to agree on how issues were going to be dealt with lunar wide. And as you can see, we had meeples. So we had meeples for the various skills. We had cubes for the various resources. So those are coming in on the ships. And then they also, were being thrown challenges to manage, and deciding on or approving projects that were lunar wide. So all of these things were thrown at the Lunar Council. So 4, 5, or 6 folks were responsible for all of that.
So our vision was that many of the operational things would be specific to bases, and the base people who didn't go to the Lunar Council would be occupied with that. And then the people who went to the Lunar Council were primarily going to deal with social issues. And there would be some instances where base problems would get out of hand, and they would go to the Lunar Council and say, can you loan us a cup of sugar from the other base? We need 3 more technicians and to solve this problem. What we really found was that the Lunar Council became a crunch point, and that the players at the bases would stop playing to watch the council do things, which was a real problem for player agency, because we want everybody involved, everybody making decisions, and everybody having a good time. Because if they lose agency, they're not going to have fun at the event. So there were things that we did in the course of the original play to keep people pulled together, and see that they were all involved, and that there were facilitators going around, adding little tidbits and helping them understand particular challenges. But we were really not fully happy with the way that worked. And yes, although some of us have seen Aftershock, the original design was one that Scott worked on, and he had not seen Aftershock, because the question says it looks like a version of Aftershock. We are pretty well versed in all the things you would expect Connections people to have seen. So yeah, I was aware of that. But Scott took the lead on this design, and I helped him tweak it as we were to refine concepts, because we're trying to basically expand our development staff. When we started this project, let me think how to explain this. Okay, so our team is all volunteers. Nobody gets money. No officers in the corporation are paid. We have almost no cash, but we have gotten some honorariums from a few events. Generally speaking, if we go and run a set of games somewhere, we'll get hotel rooms and badges to a con, and everything else is self-funded, because we're just that mentally deficient. But the point is, when we do these things, there are a few members on the staff that work year-round working on something, because it's an intellectual exercise. But mostly, we find someone who gets an idea that's really interesting to them, and we set them free, and then we coach. And that was the issue with Scott. Scott had been a player for a number of years, came onto staff for a couple of years, and said, I got this idea, could we do that? And I said, I don't know if we can do that or not. Why don't we explore it? Let's start doing some research. Let's play with the ideas and see what we can come up with. So Scott's done 70, maybe 80% of the work on this project, with other staffers chiming in on, well, here's a way we can get to that problem. Here's a way we can deal with that issue. And that's the real value, I think, of our NSDM group is, basically we're a learning organization, and we try to do things. So essentially, we do one big project a year, and we update 2 or 3 nation cells, and our stuff ages. So like, we've had done 23 countries in the modern world contemporary. of which right now 7 are suitable for play because they're close enough to the real world to be fun and interesting and pretty accurate. Cold War games, I think, are our best product because they're static. We update them based on new research. We've gotten a lot cooler descriptions over time because we're polishing that apple. But we're trying to do new things all the time so that we stay fresh, both for our player base and for ourselves. So when we played the first iteration, these were our plot complications. You want to walk through those, Scott?
Yeah. So as we kind of alluded to, there were. It became immediately clear that we had some structural problems. The meeple approach. So again, in a perfect world, meeples and supply cubes. What a great idea. Sounds like a game. But where the rubber met the road, the meeples, we had, it was complicated. There was a complex distribution sheet, which we showed you earlier, because not everyone got the same ones, so there was what do these various skills do? Because we had limited time for training, there was limited information for the players, and who, of course, were unfamiliar because they hadn't played the game. The whole cube approach, the supply cube thing, ended up was cumbersome. It ate huge amounts of time, and again, not fun. And I'll give a quick example. We had at least one player who actually cried during the game, and which was heartbreaking because I was standing right there when it happened, and but who was so confused, so frustrated, and it's like, wow, this is not going well.
Yeah, which taught us an important lesson. Now, the other thing I want to point out is this lunar game is very non-typical for what we do. It's the thing that's the same is that we're dealing with competition and cooperation, that we're dealing with unique descriptions for the positions, both in terms of, if I'm the UN supervisor in charge of communications, that's my focus, and here's some of the things that I would be interested in doing. That's the same. But this is the first game that we've actually incorporated things like meeples and supply cubes, because we run a much more unstructured game with expert adjudication. Here, what we were hoping to do with these two techniques that we had never done before was give people some insight into project management and how things can go wrong, particularly when you're in a complex, dangerous environment like the moon. What we discovered is we needed to go to another level of simplification, because our beta testing with the staff got lots of different results because of the education and background of the audience. Okay.
So again, to summarize, we discovered that the Lunar Council was a huge bottleneck that then impacted the pace of play, and although we did receive generally positive feedback, but a lot of fix this, address this types of feedback as well. We ended up only getting through 2 turns in the first game. The learning curve was harsh and painful. I think it took us like an hour and a half to 2 hours just to get through the first turn because there was just so much confusion, which was certainly partially our fault. Because again, we thought the game was more simple than it was, and again, the cubes were confusing. The committee, the Lunar Committee, the Sol Committee was a choke point, and everyone just stood around while they were meeting, waiting for them to decide things.
So the other thing I'd point out with this is that as we looked at it dynamically as it was going on, there were some things that we could do to compensate because we've done so many games. I mean, I think the count's something like, let's see, we do at least 60 games a year. And we've been doing it for 35 years, and I'm the new kid because I started in '97, so it's a lot of games. Okay. And all of those have been in-stride adjudication, and all of those have been with various play aids, but you try to simplify and improve those things as you go along. And what we discovered in all of this was that we were too close to the problem. And because we have a small group of volunteers, we basically beta tested it at our smallest convention. And that helped us a lot. Had we done it at one of the larger events, because Gen Con and Dragon Con get more than twice as many people that we get at Origins anymore, because Origins has went through its challenges. We were able to keep it together. Had we had 100-person game or whatever, we would have been just dying. And that's one of the things that we started to try to compensate for. The other thing is this particular game, because of its nature, was designed to be smaller. We basically targeted about 30 players. We wanted to do, we had like 7 turns built in, but we figured they were going to get through like 4 or 5. They wound up getting through 2. And that was a major lesson for us in terms of course correction. And since we've run it again more than one time, we've seen that we've improved that quite a bit with some of the fixes that we'll talk about in a minute. So essentially, we found the big shortcomings were the resupply cubes and that whole thing, the bottleneck of the Lunar Council. So we eliminated the supply cubes in the next iteration. We simplified meeple assignment and had a lot fewer categories. Relevant shapes is an interesting idea, Tracy. To
Merle's point, ruthless simplification. So we knew we had, I think it was 3 months before we were going to run the game again at the Culver Academies. So we had some time, and so again, the notion is like, boy, we don't have time to do everything that we thought we would want to do. So we eliminated the supply cubes, and it's like it was cute, but not going to do it.
And Tracy, I think you made a good point that if we had a longer game and wanted to try supply cubes and stuff like that again, with the advent of 3D printing, we could have had some really interesting stuff done there too.
Okay. And so again, this chart, this slide, shows. So we took the multiple skill types, and we took the multiple resource cubes, and I said, well, what if a meeple doesn't represent 40 scientists or 40 engineers or a ton of spare parts, and what if we consolidate this, and the meeple represents an ability to get things done, so it becomes more amorphous, but it becomes more more easily fungible, I suppose is a way you could say it, and more easily explained. So
essentially, we went from a variety of tokens to 2 types. You got resources in terms of material, and you got people,
which are all in the same, and both of those in the same piece of game material. So a meeple now represented an ability to get something done. So I can now throw that meeple at a problem or at a project and say, I'm going to use 3 of those or 2 of those or whatever.
So our next issue was, how do we keep everybody engaged?
Right. So
that's where we divided into the categories that you saw in the card deck, because although the card deck did talk about those being different categories as we developed it, we didn't distinguish them as clearly. So you basically have seen sort of the second iteration of the card deck. in terms of social operations and safety kinds of issues. So Scott, talk about how we handled the committee change.
So by creating and dispersing the challenges across three committees instead of a single committee, it gives every player a job, something to do, and the authority to act, as opposed to constantly going back. Well, can I do this? Can I do this? It's like so in this structure, if you head to the committee, you can make decisions on behalf of your base, to support a particular approach. This was very engaging for the players. The base commander then becomes kind of like the coach, who's sending people out, providing high level answers, sitting in on various committees as needed, but also conducting with their runner, if they have a full complement of 5 people, doing deal making while the committees are meeting with the base commanders, are talking to each other, or making side deals of various things. So this structure got all the players engaged, and proved very successful.
So Gary had a point. How do you mitigate the condition of being too close to the design? What we've found is one mitigating step is, generally speaking, with our development team, it's 2 or 3 people out of the 25, and we will run some things by the other parts of the team, but not everybody's available all the time. So the other thing is we do a lot of self-examination by having the folks that get to come to a convention to help us, but that aren't part of the design team, mitigate that. And we also try to do it so that our first run is generally at our smallest convention, where we have the most labor in terms of staff there to help with any shortfalls in communication on how things work, and the ability to do things on the fly. Because one of the things that I think is our strength, because we study a subject in detail. I mean, I think I went through at least 6 different volumes talking about potential stuff, everything from the old Bova book on Welcome to Moonbase to more modern stuff. Mark had done a lot of stuff looking at the science of the Regula and the kinds of products. We talked to a couple of people that worked with NASA on what kind of projects they were working on, and checked out the NASA sites. So we did an awful lot of examination for different pieces, but because we're able to run it at a convention that has a game of 20 or 30 people, and we want to run version of the game rather than multiple simultaneously, because we try to put bodies in seats to earn the compensation from the convention, so that people are not paying for hotel rooms out of pocket. We'll normally take 8 to 12 staffers to any one con. So that's a big part of it. We get to beta test it in that kind of an environment. We would love to be able to do it more like a regular gaming group or with locals. But our challenge is, because Strange Quirks attract, our largest concentration of staff is in Columbus, and there's 4 of us out of 25. That's Columbus, Ohio. We've got some Canadian staff people. We've got people in Georgia, people in Connecticut. We've had people in St. Louis before. People drift in and out just like with any other hobby or occupation. So we're not going to perfect that. We're only going to mitigate that. And that's part of our structure. If we were a company or we worked out of a university, we could go down to the poli-sci department and recruit all the students for a nighttime game and beta test it. That would be great, but we just haven't had that capability. Okay. So basically we focused the committees. We had one that focused on things that had to do with political and social issues. So like the Star-Crossed Lovers goes to that committee. Operations, like we found a whole bunch of volcanic tunnels that we want to build in, and what are we going to work on that? Or there's an emergency breakdown on a rover or something like that. And then the safety things are like life support and law and order and medical care. One of the challenges we gave them was there were a group of people sending around information with an encrypted code. So they were running a, let me think how to put it. How did we describe that? It was essentially they had a private chat group that bypassed all the security controls of the UN comm process. So it looked like they were spies, but they were basically just like a gaming group. And the thing is, you've got people in security because there's a security role focus at each of the bases, and they're going, oh my gosh, it's an evil plan where somebody else is trying to take over the moon. Because one of the things we also put in all of their motivations for the base commanders was, your job is to see that your base is considered the most important on the moon. You take the lead in decisions. People follow what you do. That's the way you count coup in a political sense when you're dealing with this kind of committee management. And that is one of the ways we helped focus the challenges. So everybody had something for their career professional goal and something for their organizational goal and something that has to do with, we want to do this because it's a good thing to do. So if you looked at the earlier base slide, and I think we've got one more coming up, you see that each base has a focus. So like the base put up by the People's Republic of China is all about agricultural projects. Who's interested in feeding lots and lots of people? So that was part of why we made that choice, to have a focus point for the issue for the players to examine. Yes, the evil bane of the base computer. That's right.
So again, to address the issue of slow play, and also to raise the temperature in the room, we created basically a back and forth structure. So you had the committees met every 15 minutes. So you got 15 minutes at base, and then you get a 15-minute committee meeting, and then back to base, back to committee, back to base, back to committee. With someone, mostly me, yelling, you have 5 minutes left. This raised the temperature and reinforced the notion that no, you don't get endless time to discuss this problem and all the very nuances of this. You must make a decision right now, and it's not just you, but this group of 4, 5, 6 people. So it forces them to act. And again, the feedback that we got from the faculty and from the students, that they loved this.
Yeah, and the original plan with the original model was also timed, but when we discovered that broke down, because we have the flexibility, we gave them a lot more time to resolve things because we were trying to achieve understanding. That's why we said we only got through 2 turns the first time. And we were a lot more rigorous with the time controls for these, but it also, because we had engagement, after the players went through a cycle or 2 of these decisions, they got a better sense of how to work together. And we deliberately did it in such a way that the things that were least critical to survival happened first, and the things that are more critical happen later.
Yeah,
so we an escalating chain in the way we designed it.
Yeah, we intentionally gave them easy challenges at the beginning to essentially train them in how to use how the game worked, so that then when more complex things came, it's like they were familiar with the way to fight things.
So the other thing I want to stress is, when we design a game, and particularly when we design the scenario injects to go with those games, we have an objective. It's a fit for purpose kind of situation. And it's a fit to audience kind of situation. When we started working on this, it was because Scott was interested. There were several other staffers interested. It seemed like a really good intellectual topic to work on. And we started thinking how cool this was going to be. We geeked out, okay? But our audience that we had intended were people who were science fiction fans or students. And we were trying to see that they got exposed to the kinds of challenges we discovered, because none of us were specialists to start with. And now we're really not experts, but we're relative experts. So we can tell you that from Regula, you might be able to make bricks. And from Regula, if you had unlimited power or fission reactors, you could do refining and smelting on the moon. And then we said, well, how much would you have to go through to get helium-3? And you found out you better build your plant on the edge of a crater, because you've got to go through, I forget the count, I've got it somewhere, but it's like 40 or 50 cargo containers to get a Regula to get an ounce of helium-3, and then you have to shield it from radiation so it could survive to come back. And there's a lot of that kind of technical stuff that the players are never going to see, but they're going to understand that we don't have only a couple of things. We've got a couple of things we can use here, got a couple of things we can export, but we really aren't making money. We're not a resource extraction project. We're a research extraction project. And that's the one thing that we did not really incorporate well into the game, because we couldn't figure out how to give the players a focus on specific kinds of research and give them a tangible recognition of doing it. We didn't want to run with just victory points, because it's too abstract, because we are a live action role-playing game at the foundation, and they have to have that visceral connection to the game.
So
that's part of how and why we're designing.
So one of the things I incorporated in this second version was, in order to provide that incentive, to incentivize, was a reward system. So so when they succeeded in completing a project, for the most part, they were rewarded with an additional meeple. Which is like, oh, you're more efficient now, or you know more, or that sort of thing. And large projects, so lunar wide projects where they were working together across several bases, they were being rewarded 2 or 3 meeples for the entire project, which then they could split amongst each other. Again, with the notion of, you're now more productive, you have more something, So, but the idea to give them a reason to do something, because in that first game, one of the players said, why on earth am I, would I want to do X? This, it's like, what's the benefit, to my base? And we thought, well, because it's cool. It's like, not enough.
So the other thing I want to point out is that the technique that Scott just talked about works really well in a short game, but would not work in a longer game. So we have to come up with another approach if we ever want to try to run this as an 8-hour situation, because essentially more meeples is a money machine. And it's meant to incentivize so that we get the educational points across, and it works fine if you're doing 4, 5, 6, 7 rounds, but you do 15 rounds or 10 rounds, and you're going to have a pile of resources that are going to be totally unrealistic. We really over rewarded in order to get them to move forward and get them exposed to the other issues. And it goes back to fit for purpose. Our goal was to expose our players to something that was interesting and make it fun. So that's a different goal than you have if you're trying to do a research game or something like that. And the challenges they were given were programmed in such a way that you might have people that want to play your game again and again, but they're not going to play it 20 times because they'll have seen all the variation on the major themes. And that's an important thing to recognize. We get about a 30 to 40% return rate of any single game. There's about that percentage of people in it that have played with us before, because we've been around for 35 years. even when we go back to educational places, we've done Culver Academies 3 times as sort of a private school visit. And there's a proportion of your players that help educate your other players. But at a certain point, that level of education is gaming the system. So you got to be careful, and you got to mix it up, and you got to recognize that what you have to do when the audience changes or when the purpose changes. Okay, so check the second try. Okay, and what we've used since is this second try approach. Oh, come on, these are the kinds of things that we figured out. Scott?
Yeah. So again, the changing the structure, to dispersion and delegation of authority, absolutely worked. By which then also facilitated the pace that we were looking for, which was greater urgency. The feedback we got. So again, we ran the second version at the Culver Academies in Indiana. And we got enthusiastic feedback from both the players, the students, as well as the faculty. They were thrilled, and of course they invited us back, which is always important. We got 3 times as many turns in, and those turns were actually fun turns as opposed to painful turns. The whole system of meeples as a item representing a more generic ability proved to be a very easy mechanic that was easily explained, and so the players were able to really quickly get it and move forward and start playing. The committee system got everyone, all the players involved in decision making and problem solving, which was absolutely one of our key educational goals. And again, they became inventive about large projects. And in fact, even though it was not, they actually on some of the projects got people to help them on smaller projects as well. Again, the players became very inventive about how to get things done, which was definitely something we were hoping for.
So essentially, the next thing is, what are our future plans? Well, this is all part of that cycle of research that Peter Perla talks about, and how we adapt to the learning examples and approaches of our players. So we've sort of talked about that, but I want you to understand part of the process is self-examination, and that's how we manage as we move forward over time. So now we're to more space for questions and comments. We've tried to answer things as we go along. So if you've got anything else that you want us to cover, please type it in. And I'll do the little commercial while we wait for that, because essentially we're going to be at Origins again this year, Gen Con and Dragon Con. We now have a regular website again, because our original website was run by a volunteer, and they left and took the domain name with them accidentally. So we now have a new website, which is the NSDM game site. Let me pull that up real quick. And we'll be posting our schedule. We're just about finalized on our Origin schedule. So both the lectures that we do, because we do technology, history, and political science type stuff, I'll be posted on that. We're going to run 4 games at Origins and 6 at Gen Con and Dragon Con. And we're a regular installment at all of those. Also, I'd like to point out that this is Origin's 50th year. And one of the things they've asked us to do is, if you know of anybody who attended some of the early conventions, they want to do a retrospective, so please share. You'll also find some of NSDM's prior videos on the earlier Connections Online conferences. You'll find us at the CX_Wargaming site, which has the Connections USA convention from 21. Actually, we didn't do a presentation there, but that's out there for you. And there are a few things listed on our YouTube channel, but most of our new broadcasts are in Connections Online, and there's one at one of the ACDC conventions. So if you want to see other content that we've done where we talk about our American Revolution game, our regular game, some of our other background, I am not seeing any other questions. And since we don't have any, I want to thank you all for joining us. Yeah,
Merle, I did want to add, and it's like, but if for anyone who was wondering, so this next iteration, so we are going to run this again at Origins here in a couple months, and probably the biggest tweak is to that reward system. So our next iteration is going to scale back that reward system. There will be, our plan is to provide a few extra meeples over the course of a game, but not the freewheeling rewards, but rather they will receive essentially a time limited or a one-time only reward that will not only say like a one-use meeple and then it disappears, as opposed to coming back. So that would be one type. There will also be say morale boosts and some other limited use rewards. Our thought is that will keep the incentives, but try to restrain the imbalancing effect that we had in the second game.
And thank you all for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed Connections Online and the few sessions we still have. Some of you might be interested in the Liftoff 2 session this afternoon, where we're going to have a demo of how that game will play as it's getting ready for its Kickstarter. And thank you so much again. Have a wonderful time.